My name is Erica Dalton. I'm 33 years old. And the first time I met my future mother-in-law, she decided what I was worth before dinner reached the main course. Benjamin and I had been engaged for 3 months, and he warned me that his mother cared about titles, schools, and careers that sounded impressive. Before we went inside, he asked if I wanted him to explain what I did. I said no because I wanted them to meet me before they met my job title. Kathleen asked about my work while Martin poured wine. I told her I worked in aviation operations and safety, but she asked whether I had considered becoming a pilot. Then she mentioned that Benjamin had once dated a commercial pilot and said she had pictured him with someone whose career people understood. Martin tried to sound kinder, saying airport operations must be stable work and every industry needed people handling details behind the scenes. I felt Benjamin's hand tighten around mine, but I stayed calm. Kathleen kept talking as if she were helping me. She said my work probably offered hours for family and joked that someone had to keep the paperwork moving while pilots made the important decisions. Benjamin started to correct her, but I touched his wrist and stopped him. I was not ashamed of anything she believed about me, and I did not need a title to defend my dignity. What bothered me was how quickly her warmth changed once she decided I belonged lower on the ladder. By dessert, I knew what I wanted to learn. I was not interested in whether Kathleen Prescott would respect Erica Dalton, Director of Flight Safety and Operational Risk. I wanted to know whether she would respect the woman she believed handled airport paperwork behind people with better titles. If respect appeared only after she learned what authority I had, then it was never respect at all. I smiled, finished my coffee, and let her keep believing she had figured me out. Over the next few weeks, Kathleen never said anything cruel enough to challenge directly. That was what made it difficult. Every comment arrived wrapped like a compliment, soft enough that if I objected, I would look oversensitive. At a family lunch, she introduced me as Benjamin's fiancé who worked behind the scenes at the airport. Then she added that every industry needed dependable people handling the details. Another afternoon, one of her friends mentioned an upcoming trip and complained about changing a reservation. Kathleen turned toward me and said, "Erica probably knows how to fix that." I told her that I did not handle passenger bookings. She laughed and said she could never keep all those airport jobs straight. Before I could answer, she began praising a nephew who had made partner at an accounting firm. Benjamin noticed every time. At first, he corrected small things, telling his mother that my work was more technical than she understood. But Kathleen waved him off. Once, after dinner, he asked why I kept stopping him from saying more. I told him I did not want my title used like a weapon every time someone underestimated me. He looked at me and said there was a difference between refusing to brag and letting someone else define me. That stayed with me because he was right. I had told myself I was giving Kathleen a chance to show me who she was, but part of me had started waiting to see how far she would go. Silence felt controlled, and I liked feeling controlled. I did not yet realize that control could become its own kind of stubbornness. A few days later, Kathleen called Benjamin with plans for our engagement weekend. The Prescott family had reserved Warren Ridge Lodge in Montana, and nearly 10 relatives would fly out together on a private charter before the rest joined us there. Kathleen treated the trip like a celebration and a presentation at the same time. She wanted every detail polished, every guest impressed, and every hour scheduled. I had no idea that the flight itself would become the first moment none of us could smooth over. The engagement weekend began with exactly the kind of thing Kathleen loved. A trip she could turn into proof that everything in her life was polished and important. The Prescott family had arranged a private charter from Denver to Montana, and nearly 10 of us were traveling together before the rest joined us at Warren Ridge Lodge. Benjamin and I arrived early, but Kathleen was already moving through the terminal checking bags, confirming cars, and reminding everyone about dinner reservations. She looked completely at home. While we waited, one of Benjamin's relatives asked what I did in aviation. Before I could answer, Kathleen smiled and said I worked around airplanes. just not in the glamorous part. She added that I was probably useful if anyone lost luggage or needed help with a reservation. Julia glanced at me, then at Kathleen, but I smiled and changed the subject. I had stopped expecting Kathleen to hear herself. Boarding was supposed to begin minutes later. As we walked toward the aircraft, I noticed a fresh dark streak on the pavement near the main landing gear. Most passengers would have walked past it without thinking. Airports are full of stains and equipment marks that mean nothing. I stopped anyway. The position of the streak bothered me, and the surface still looked wet. Franklin Moore, the lead maintenance technician on the ramp, was nearby. So I asked whether the aircraft had been serviced recently. He crouched down and studied the area for several seconds. Then he asked a technician to bring a light and inspection cloth. Kathleen noticed we had stopped and called over that boarding was starting. I told her we needed a few minutes before anyone got on. She frowned and asked if there was actually a problem. I said I did not know yet, and that was exactly why I wanted it checked. Franklin looked up and said they needed to inspect the gear area before he was comfortable clearing it. That was when Kathleen's smile disappeared. She looked at the waiting family, then back at me, as if I had personally delayed her weekend. I could already see the question forming on her face now. Why was the woman she thought handled airport paperwork suddenly making decisions beside her private plane? The first 10 minutes passed. Franklin and another technician stayed near the landing gear while Captain Laura Mitchell remained beside the aircraft, waiting for an answer. Then 10 minutes became 20, and the mood inside the terminal changed. People stopped checking their phones and started looking at me. Franklin finally came back and said the fluid might be connected to the hydraulic system, but he needed more time before he could identify the source. Laura nodded and said boarding would remain delayed until maintenance cleared the aircraft. Kathleen stared at both of them, then turned to me. That was when she realized I had been the one who asked for the inspection. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Erica, are we really holding everyone here because of one stain on the pavement?" I told her we were holding because we did not know what the stain meant yet. She said the plane already had a release and Martin had people waiting for him in Montana. Then she added that turning a small concern into a delay felt unnecessary. I kept my voice even. I said, nobody should board until Franklin finished checking the system. Kathleen looked toward Laura and asked whether the captain could simply make the decision and continue. Laura answered that she would not move the aircraft while maintenance was still evaluating a safety concern. Kathleen's expression tightened because the answer did not give her the control she wanted. Then she looked directly at me and asked what authority I had to interfere with a charter the family had already paid for. I opened my mouth, but Benjamin answered first. He said he did not care what title I had or whether anyone else understood my job. If I believed we should stay off that airplane, he was staying off it too. Kathleen stared at her son. She reminded him that we could miss our dinner reservation and disrupt the weekend. Benjamin did not move. He said dinner could wait, and so could every other plan they had made. For the first time since I had met his mother, he was not trying to keep the peace. He was choosing a side before anyone could prove I was right. That mattered more to me than anything he could have said after the truth came out. Kathleen seemed convinced the argument would end as soon as someone with real authority showed up. I could see it in the way she looked past me toward the terminal offices, waiting for a manager to restore the schedule she wanted. Instead, I pulled out my phone and called Operations Control. I gave them the aircraft tail number and requested a formal safety hold until maintenance completed the inspection. Kathleen heard enough to realize I had just made the delay official. She asked what exactly I thought I was doing. Before I could answer, an operations manager came through the terminal doors and walked straight toward us. He stopped beside me and said, "Director Dalton, Operations Control has the hold in place." The room went quiet. Kathleen looked from him to me, then toward Benjamin as if someone had changed the rules without telling her. Captain Laura explained that I was Director of Flight Safety and Operational Risk for the operator that managed the aircraft. She added that once my department opened a safety hold, no schedule, client request, or VIP status could override it. Kathleen's face lost its color. Martin stared at me without speaking. Julia looked surprised too, but hers was a different kind of surprise, because she had never needed my title to take me seriously. Benjamin stayed beside me and said nothing, which somehow made the moment feel even sharper. Then Franklin came back from the aircraft. He said the inspection had found a hydraulic line fitting showing signs of failure, along with enough fluid loss that the plane was being removed from service immediately. There would be no quick repair on the ramp, and no flight to Montana on that aircraft. The plane would be towed into the hangar for a full maintenance review. Kathleen finally understood that this was no longer about a stain, a delayed dinner, or whether I had overreacted. She looked at the aircraft, then back at me. Her voice was much quieter when she asked, in front of everyone, why I had never told them who I really was. I told her I had told them what I did from the beginning. She shook her head and said that was not what she meant. I knew exactly what she meant. She wanted to know why I had not given her the title that would have made her treat me differently. I looked at her and said, I told you what I did. You decided how little that meant. What hurt Kathleen most was not learning that my title was bigger than she had imagined. It was realizing I had stopped everyone from boarding before she knew that title existed. Martin asked how serious the hydraulic problem was, and I answered carefully because fear was not useful. I told him nobody could promise the fitting would have failed after takeoff, but nobody responsible would gamble on finding out in the air. A replacement aircraft was being arranged, which meant we had hours to wait. Kathleen sat in the terminal, quieter than I had seen her. Finally, she said she was sorry and admitted she had no idea I had that much authority. The wording made me pause because it showed she was still measuring the lesson by rank. I told her that if I had actually been a scheduler, a gate coordinator, or the person handling paperwork, her comment still would have been wrong. Respect was not supposed to rise with someone's job title. Kathleen looked down at her hands and said she thought she had been making harmless jokes. I said harmless jokes usually did not leave one person constantly proving they deserved to be in the room. Martin asked whether people in aviation had the power to stop a flight over one concern. I explained that good safety systems were designed that way on purpose. The person who noticed a problem did not need to be the most important person present. They needed a way to speak, and everyone else needed enough discipline to listen. Later, Benjamin and I found a corner near the windows. He apologized for all the times he had called silence keeping the peace, when I was the one paying for that peace. I told him he had been right about me too. I had let the misunderstanding continue because part of me wanted Kathleen to keep revealing how far her assumptions would go. Admitting that did not erase what she had said, but it made the situation more honest. Benjamin reached for my hand and said we could not build a marriage around tests. Neither of us admitted we were giving. I agreed. If we were going to become a family, we needed boundaries, said out loud, not lessons delivered after someone failed them. By the time the replacement aircraft was ready, the trip felt different from the one Kathleen had planned. The real consequences did not show up during the engagement weekend. They appeared after everyone went home, when the adrenaline was gone and apologizing was no longer the easiest thing in the room. Kathleen did not become a different person overnight. A few weeks later, at a family dinner, she started to introduce me by saying, Erica is the director of flight safety, then stopped herself halfway through. She smiled awkwardly and simply said, This is Erica, Benjamin's fiancée. That small correction meant more to me than another apology would have. She was learning not to replace one label with a more impressive one. Martin changed in a different way. At his development company, he created a direct process for construction and facilities teams to escalate safety concerns without waiting for several layers of management. He told Benjamin the airport had made him realize how dangerous it was when people closest to a problem felt they needed permission to speak. Kathleen's real test came at a charity aviation event several weeks later. Franklin was there with members of the maintenance team, wearing the same practical work clothes he had worn at the terminal. Kathleen recognized him, walked over, and thanked him for stopping the flight when he found the hydraulic problem. She did not ask his title, his position, or who he reported to. Franklin just smiled and told her that everyone had done their part. Julia happened to be standing beside me when it happened. She watched Kathleen walk away, then said that was the first apology she completely believed. I knew exactly what she meant. Kathleen had stopped trying to prove she understood the lesson and had started behaving differently when there was no audience demanding it. That was the part I had been waiting for. Later, Kathleen admitted she used to think knowing someone's job helped her know how much weight to give their opinion. Now she understood that respect had to come before the resume, not after it. I told her trust would take time, but I could see she was doing the work. She nodded and did not ask me to forgive her faster. For the first time, that felt like enough for me now. 3 months later, our wedding did not turn the flight into a victory story. Benjamin and I chose a small outdoor ceremony close to home, with family, friends, and no attempt to make the day feel bigger than it needed to be. Kathleen never mentioned my title when she welcomed guests. She simply introduced me as Erica. Before the ceremony, she pulled me aside and said she had learned something she wished she had understood years earlier. She said the person who speaks up is not always the person with the biggest title, and the person being ignored is not always wrong. I told her that was closer to what I had wanted her to understand from the beginning. She smiled and said she knew. Martin was quieter about everything, but I noticed the difference in him too. He asked questions now before giving opinions, especially when someone with less authority raised a concern. Julia teased him about becoming easier to work with, and he admitted he probably was. Nobody treated the changes like a grand redemption because they were still new. After the ceremony, Benjamin and I stood together while the last photos were being taken. He smiled and said his mother finally understood who she had been dealing with. I shook my head and told him that was never the point. I did not want anyone to respect me because they discovered I had power. I wanted them to understand that respect should come before proof. The day at the airport stayed with me for a long time because the smallest warning had mattered more than the entire schedule everyone was trying to protect. Sometimes the way we treat people we think cannot help us says more about our character than any title ever could. If this story reminded you of someone who was underestimated, tell me in the comments. Share it with someone who needs it. And subscribe for more stories about family, boundaries, and the moments that force us to see each other clearly.